Amen. All right. Well, good morning, family. What a treat it is to be here this morning. I am so grateful for what God did last week. Wasn't that amazing to have Pastor Danessa here? She did an incredible job. She is one of the most prolific communicators, and I just love as I see God work in her heart and in her life. And so I know we had a great weekend with the women's retreat or conference, and then also on Sunday morning. I'm so grateful that she was with us, and I would just say this, that for both Pastor Danessa and Pastor Zach, they are a blessing to us. We love them, and it's good to have part of the Elevate community family here, because what we know is that y'all are blessed in Hawaii to have them, and we're a little bit jealous, you know. As an older brother, I'm like, man, I wish I was closer to them, but we've got an ocean in between us, and so we don't get to always see each other, but it's so great to just see what God is doing in their lives. Now, to see how God has worked in them as they have had this dream to plant the church over the last nearly 4 years now, it's just amazing to see how God has worked, how they've taken steps of faith along the way. And in the end, what really Pastor Danessa challenged us with is to take the next step. Like, what is the next step for us? Like, God has given us a promise. He's spoken things into our hearts, and really it's about asking, what is the next step? And I know that walking away from last week on Sunday, I knew what the next step was for me, and throughout the week, I know what the next step is and how God is working in that and how God is moving in that, and I know He's leading, and it's just one step at a time. You know, for me, if you're anything like me, you don't want to just know the next step, you want to know the next 15 steps, right? You're like, Lord, I want to know like A, B, C, actually A through Z. Just give me all those things, and then, I'll know where to go and what to do. But it's one step at a time, and it's really knowing that we want to be obedient with that and let God lead us along the way. And so I don't know what God challenged you with last week, but I pray that you were faithful to what He put before you. And I want to just say God is at work in our lives. God is at work in our church. And we are expecting of what God will continue to do in and through our lives. Now, as we continue to talk about the dream that God has put before us, we're coming back to our Inception series, and we're talking about the dream that God has put before us. And I want to really confront what I would call an ever-present backstory in any dream. There's this ever-present backstory in every dream. It's certainly something that Joshua faced throughout his life in leadership. Now, Pastor Danessa talked about the life of Joshua and alluded to his leadership and what God did in his life. And we're gonna touch on that a bit, but we're not gonna come into the details, the complete details of that transition. But we're gonna come back to it a little bit. And what we see, though, is that there was this backstory that was playing out in the life of Joshua. We know this because the Lord ultimately reassured him several times in Joshua chapter 1. And what I'm talking about this morning is dealing with the doubt of a dream. And so here's the thing, it's nice to have a dream. It's nice to think about what God would do. It's nice to think about how God will move in our lives, how God will move in our families, how God will move in our church, maybe how God will move in our city. It's nice to think about those things and to have a dream about what God will do. But at the end of the day, what we need to know is that there are going to be doubts along the way. Because in our dreams, we will experience doubt. And in fact, I have to believe that that's exactly what Joshua was experiencing, because on several occasions in Joshua chapter 1, and we're not going to go there today, the Lord reassures Joshua, be strong and courageous, for I am with you. Be strong and courageous. He says that phrase at least 3 distinct times. And then even at the end of Joshua chapter 1, when it comes to the conclusion, the people mimic that same message to Joshua, saying, be strong and courageous. And so there had to have been some doubts that he battled through. And there's a constant, I would say this about life and about our lives, that there is a constant battle between faith and fear, right? There's this constant ongoing tug of war between doubt and certainty. There's this challenge between belief and unbelief. Like we want to believe, we want to have faith, we want to be certain, but the truth is that we battle from the inside out. We battle with doubt. And I wish that, I don't know if at some age in life it goes away. I'm too young to know what that age might be. But the truth is there is somewhere off or somewhere in our lives, I don't know if there's a moment where we stop wrestling with doubt. I don't know that. But I know that whatever God speaks to us, whatever dream he puts before us, whatever dream he puts before us in the grand scheme of life or in the day-to-day things of life, ultimately there are going to be doubts along the way. And we experience this. Sometimes it's daily. Sometimes it's many times throughout a day. Sometimes it happens many times in just the moments of our lives, but we certainly do experience doubts, disbelief, and ultimately fears. And so there's this backstory. We're believing God for the very best. I don't know what you're believing God for. We're believing God for the very best in our lives personally, in our families, as a church, but ultimately there's this backstory of what may be transpiring, and we ultimately walk through moments of doubt. Now I want to go back today as we think about Joshua and what God did in his life. I want to go back to roughly 40 years prior to Joshua chapter 1. And so we're kind of taking a step backward in terms of the story, the chronology of the story, and we're looking at Joshua and what God did there. But I want to back up, because as we're going to learn about the backstory, we've got to go back to an interaction that happened really at the doorstep of the Promised Land. It was at the very onset of the Promised Land. What God was about to do in the nation of Israel, and through the life and leadership of Joshua, and really the leadership of Moses, there was this moment where they were at the doorstep of the promise of God. They were at the doorstep of the Promised Land and what God would do there and how he would move. And so in that moment, they were completely expectant of what God would do. They were at the doorstep of the Promised Land. Now I have to imagine that they were pretty excited, that they had gone through the history. If you look at the history of the nation of Israel, they had been captive, and they were in the nation, they were captives, they were slaves really in the nation of Egypt, and as they were in slavery, God brought freedom to them, and they were exiled, or there was this exodus that happened from Egypt into the Promised Land. But as they began to see God move and hear the promises and see the promises, they knew that God had promised them a very land of their own, and yet they weren't quite there yet, but they were at the doorstep. And so I just want you to imagine, I don't know what God has promised you or your family or what maybe dream he's put in your life, but I want you to imagine that you're standing at the doorstep of that, and what would you feel? What are the expectations, and what is the anticipation that you would be sensing? I'm sure it would be one of joy and elation, and it's almost like I can just reach out and touch what God has promised me. It's right in front of me. And so you would envision that. Now, as Moses and the people are preparing to enter the Promised Land, ultimately, they're stopped in their tracks. They're stopped at a moment, and it's there we encounter a situation filled with both doubt and belief, where there's this contrast of doubt and belief. And so go with me. We're going to be looking at Numbers chapter 13 today, starting in verse 1. And we're going to read a large portion of chapter 13, but we're also going to hit some highlights, because ultimately it's a lot to read, and so we're going to try to do our best to highlight. So Numbers chapter 13, starting in verse 1. It says, "The Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving you, or giving to the Israelites." It's a promise. God is indeed promising the nation of Israel. He's promising Moses that the Promised Land is coming. He's reassuring them of what he's saying he's going to do. And so the Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders. And so what God does is he instructs Moses to choose 12 leaders from each of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel, and they are to go into the Promised Land. They are to spy it out, and they are to really discover what the land is all about. It continues on in verse 3, and it reads like this. It says, "So at the Lord's command, Moses sent them out from the desert of Paran. All of them were leaders of the Israelites." Now, you're going to notice we jump from verse 3 to verse 17. I would encourage you to go back and read later throughout your devotional reading this week. In fact, all of it. Chapter 12, it's kind of a different subject, but yet it's just as powerful. Chapter 13, where we're at, and then even chapter 14. But I would encourage you to go and read, and what it does is it names the 12. And really, there's only two that we should keep track of. Their names are Caleb and Joshua. There are the two that we should really keep track of. But verse 17, not only does Moses send them out into the Promised Land, but then he gives them these instructions. He says, when Moses sent them to explore Canaan, he said, "Go up through the Negev and on into the hill country. see what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. And so Moses gives them some instructions. He's saying, look, when you go into the promised land, you need to take some notes. You need to be mindful of what you're about to experience. I want you to take notes. I want you to see what the land is like. I want you to take notes about the people. Are the people strong or are they weak? Are the people few or are they many? Like what kind of people are there? What exactly is transpiring? What is happening? I want you to take note. And so the 12, they have a task. And if you can envision this with me, they're to go into the promised land and they're to go with a specific task in mind. They're to explore the land. They're to take note of the people. They're to take note whether they're strong or weak, few or many. Verse 19. What kind of land do they have? What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? And so it goes on. What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? And so really, Moses is beginning to take inventory about the promised land. Why? Because they're receiving the promise of God, and they know that one day they will enter into the promise of God, and they will enter into the promised land, and they've got to know what's going on. They've got to know what's happening and what's transpiring in the land that's in front of them. They've got to know it. They've got to know, what kind of enemy are they going to encounter? Because ultimately, they're going to encounter an enemy that truthfully does not want them to take the land, right? And so they're going to go into this land and they're going to have enemies and there's going to be warfare and battle. And then not only taking note of the size of the people, how many people, right? They want to know how many are we going to encounter and so really it's a war strategy, if you will. And then the other piece of that is they want to know, well, hey, are the cities that they live in, are they fortified cities? Are they unwalled cities? Like, can we easily defeat them? Are they, or what is it going to be like? And then he has even bigger vision than that, which is he begins to really spell out not only what they're going to encounter, but then he begins to spell out also, will the land be fruitful? What is the land like? What is the soil like? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? And so I can only imagine that they're going through and they're taking note and they're noting of all the people and they're noting the soils and they're testing the soils and they're seeing what kind of crops are growing and what's happening there. He goes on to ask, are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. And what we know about this as we read on is that ultimately this was the season by which there were grapes, and it was the first ripe grapes that were coming into season at that time. And so, how many of y'all like grapes? Anybody like grapes? Okay, good. All right, I'm in good company. I like grapes. But I'll tell you what, the best grapes I really enjoy are the green, really big, juicy ones. You know what I'm talking about? And then they have those cotton candy grapes. Have you ever had those? That's just strange. But you know you like them, right? I think they made those for kids so that kids ate them. But adults, we end up like taking them from the kids, right? Like, give me those are mine. Well, here's the deal. Last night, we're hanging out, and I was like, I was chilling out on the, couch. We're just kind of hanging out as a family. And Selah comes out. She brings a little container full of grapes. And I'm not even hungry. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't even want a grape, to be really honest with you. I'm good. I'm like, and yet in that moment, I'm like, hey, Selah, can you, throw me one of those grapes? It was like, save me a piece of that corn for later kind of moment, Nacho fans, you get it? Okay. So I'm like, say, can you throw me one of those grapes? And I'm like, just one, I'm good, And she throws one over, and as I get the grape and I eat it, immediately I'm like, oh, Jesus. Because it was so good, right? So then what do I tell her? Hey, maybe just two more. Just two more. Can you throw me two more? And then they throw me another one, and then another one. No, okay, just two more. And then before you know it, I'm like, how about a little handful? You know what I'm saying? Just a little hand. Like, I only wanted one, then I had two, then four, then six, then eight. Now just, now a little handful will do. And before you know it, I get my lazy self up off the couch and I walk over to where she is, because how many of you know I wanted more grapes? Right? Now, how many of you know you're going to go buy some grapes after church today? Okay. And so it was the season for the first ripe grapes. And so they go and they survey the land. they see what's going on. We fast forward to verse 21. It says, so they went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rehob toward Lebo Hamath. And so they do all their exploration. Verse 25, we skip a few verses there. At the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. So the people, the 12 leaders of the nation of Israel that went to go explore the land, the 12 leaders of the tribe, they spent 40 days exploring the land. And so it wasn't a fly-by-night thing. They didn't just come in and, spend the night there and then come back and say, hey, it's a great land. No, they did their homework. Now, how many of you know if you're going to spend 40 days somewhere, you're going to do your homework? You're going to know everything about the land. You're going to know, what it's like. You're going to know what the people are like. You're going to do a lot of counting. You're going to figure out how many people, what size were they, were they little, were they big? You're going to know a lot of things about a place in 40 days, right? And so they go out, they explore the land, they return after 40 days, and they return and they begin to describe what happens. Now, what you have to know is at this point in the story, everybody's on the same page. Everybody's in agreement, especially speaking of the 12. They are in absolute agreement as to what took place. And so verse 26, it says, they came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. Now, can you imagine what that moment was like? They come in and they tell all that's happened. They tell everything they've seen. They tell all that's taken place, and then they even show them the fruit of the land. In verse 27, they gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. It's an exciting thing. Here is its fruit. And so really they get the fruit, and part of the story, as you read it on your own later, you're going to realize that the fruit, this cluster of grapes that they brought, was so large a cluster of grapes that they actually carried it. 2 men carried it. And they put it on their shoulders. And when I think about this story, I always wonder if the 2 men carrying the fruit were Caleb and Joshua. And I wonder if Caleb and Joshua on the way, had to just, come on, just give me one. Moses won't notice if we just take one, I just have to, because when they got back, they were determined to go back to the land. The other 10 were not. Anyway, side story, back to what we're talking about. And so they get to Moses, they say, here's the fruit. And I can only imagine that Moses, in that moment, he took the fruit, he looked at it, and it was this just amazing, ripe, green grape. And he took a bite. He didn't throw the whole thing in his mouth because that thing was big. He took a bite. It was like eating an apple or something. I don't know. And he takes this bite. And y'all can, right now, your saliva glands they're working for you right now because you're thinking about the grape. A little bit sweet, a little bit tart. Oh, yeah. And Moses is in front of the people and he's eating this grape and it's like, come on, dude. Tell us, how good is it? It's amazing, right? And it's a land flowing with milk and honey. And Jimmy was telling me a little bit about that in between services. Jimmy told me, hey, I've been there and I've explored the land when he was in the Navy and he was deployed out there. And he said, I was able to see what this was all about. And you got to understand that it was a desert. And really, they were moving into Canaan, which this particular area of land had plenty of water, which because of the water, there was significance of honey and bees and activity and flowers and growth. And there was also the reality that the cows were able to drink water by which they were able to produce milk. And so it was a land flowing with milk and honey. It was a fruitful, vibrant land because of the water that was in the land. And I want to go on a field trip. Anybody else want to go on a field trip to the land flowing with milk and honey, right? And so here it is. Everybody's in agreement at this time, and it's a great moment. I can just imagine the people. They're like, we want to taste the fruit, and they're ready to go to war. to go get the fruit, and they're excited about the land flowing with milk and honey. Every time I hear flowing with milk and honey, I'm sorry, but what I see is like rivers, you know, and like the milk's like coming down, and it's like Chocolate Mountain or something. Anyway, that's a side one. It's Chocolate Mountain, and the milk is flowing, and the honey's like just coming to. Anyway, okay, back to reality. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Okay, Earth 2 Junction Community Church. We're back. Verse 28. Okay, verse 28. It says, it starts off with this word, and the word is, what's the word? But. Land flowing with milk and honey and all this good stuff and all that's happening and whoa, and then but. And let me just say this, whenever you have a dream, you're going to have a but. And sometime that but is going to be a person, and you're going to call them a but. Never mind, that's a whole other thing. That's another message. Pastor Dinesh is preaching that one today at Elevate. But anytime, you just got to know this in your life and in your family and in what you're dreaming about and what you're hoping God for, believing God for, and what you're hoping for, and in our lives as a church, every time we have a dream from God, there is going to be a great big but. There's going to be one of those interruptions that causes doubt in our lives. And so in verse 28 it says, but the people who live there are powerful. And they go on to share that they're powerful and the cities are fortified and very large. They're not just large, they're very large. And, you know, and so they go on and they begin to spread this message of fear and doubt in the people. It says, we even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. And so not only do they experience, and they're like, hey, there's these great big, there's all this going on. But what they say is, look, the Amalekites live in the Negev. The Negev is this portion of the wilderness in the southern part of the region where we're talking about. And in that wilderness area, they're like, hey, the people are there. And we've got flashing lights, and I don't know what that is other than the Lord. So we just say, yes, sir, I don't know what that is. So the Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. In other words, when you come up out of the in the Negev, and you move into the hill country where the people are and where all that's happening, when you move into that, there's now another set of people, and it's the Amalekites, it's the Hittites, and the Jebusites. Or the Amorites, rather. I'm messing that up. Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites. And so out of the Negev, you get into the hill country, and you start to experience this, and you see all kinds of chaos there. And then he says, and then the Canaanites live near the sea along the Jordan. And so then you see all that's happening there. And it's like there's people, and they're going to defeat us. Reading on. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. I like people like Caleb, because what we learn about this story is there are 10 of the 12 that went to go survey the land, and all 10 of them are saying, we can't do this. The people this, the people that, the land this, the land that, the fortified cities, there's no way, it's impossible, there's no way it's going to happen. And yet there's two, Caleb, Joshua being the other one. We read more about him in chapter 14. But ultimately we realize that these two are saying we can do it. And I love Caleb, because Caleb is sitting around and he could be quiet. He could be, just sit back and say, well, these 10, they don't agree and they don't think it's going to happen. And But I should probably just go along because it's 10 versus 2, and I should probably just step back and not say anything. But what happens? Then Caleb silenced the people. Hey, everybody listen up. Before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land. For we, what's the word there? Can certainly do it. We can certainly do it. It goes on to read. But the men who had gone up with him said, we what? Can't. We can't. We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And again, if you're going to have a dream, you're definitely going to face some doubt. And let me just say this. There's been a lot of people over the course of my life that have spoken doubt to me, just like these. These 10 come around and Caleb's saying we can do it, and they're saying no, you can't. No, we can't. And they're the doubters. They're the doubters of life. Maybe you might want to call them haters. But they're the people who are unbelievers. They don't believe that you can do it. In fact, in my life, I've faced doubters many times. I'll never forget. And if you're an educator here, please just hear my heart. But I had a real rough time in education. And it wasn't because I wasn't a smart kid. It was because I was probably just a troublemaker. I was, who knows? It was before the days of ADHD and all those other things. And so, you didn't really know. You just knew that this kid was rambunctious, a troublemaker. And I'll never forget what it was like to be in the 5th grade and to be sat at the front of my classroom, and my teacher to tell me, you're never going to amount to anything. You'll never be anything. In fact, I'm going to make you sit up front because you just don't know how to behave in class. And everybody look at this, and I don't know if she used these words, but it was kind of like, look at this idiot of a kid, and I was just that was me in the 5th grade. And in the 8th grade, I had a similar experience where I'll never forget the teacher was just telling me how I was never going to be, and I had enough. And so I grabbed my desk, because the desks were mobile. I grabbed the desk, and I swung the desk, and I threw it at her desk. And I'm like, and what? My mom and dad didn't think that was too cool. And some of you are like, Pastor, you've never done anything like that. I know. I'm just, but in that moment, I threw my desk, and and that teacher, man, I didn't say this in the first service, but you got to know something about that teacher. I turned in an assignment in that class, and that teacher had nothing but negative things to have to say about me. Pastor Danessa happened to be in that class the following year. I forget how far apart we were in school. I think the following year. And guess whose project was the best project ever done? But I got kicked out of that class, couldn't go back for the rest of the year, hung out in the principal's office. You see, the point is I've had people tell me that I was never going to accomplish anything, that I was never going to amount to anything. I've had educators tell me that. Now today, I'm back in school, back in college, and anytime I get something less than an A, I'm just ticked off about it. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, there's no way, because that teacher in 5th grade, she's a liar. That teacher in 8th grade was a liar. And when they kicked me out of school in 9th grade, they all liars. Because I'm making it. And in college, I've got, straight A's. And so the point is this, though. Even into very recently, within the last couple months, I've literally had people tell me that you are not going to make it in life. And I say, watch God do what only God can do. In fact, I would agree with you. If it's up to me and if it's up to me doing it, you're absolutely right. I cannot do it. But thanks be to God that God can do the immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine according to his power that is at work within us. That's who we serve. Amen? But the men who were there had gone up with him and said, we can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. Another version says they were giants. There's no way. It's impossible. And if you think about the giants, the reality about that is that they were descendants of Anak. They were descendants from way back that were called people from the very earliest text of the Bible. They talked about the giants. And so it's believed that one of their descendants was none other than Goliath. And so the truth is they said these people are giants. We saw the Nephilim there. Reading on, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like what? What are grasshoppers good for? Okay, no, maybe you wouldn't do that. You would never squash a bug. You're like, oh. But these people, that's all they were thinking about. You just got to put it into context. I know we're all politically correct, but we never squash a bug. But I'm telling you, that black widow crawling across your floor, you're going to squash that real quick, right? No. We seemed like grasshoppers to them. And we looked the same to them. And so they walked around and they filled the people with doubt. There were 10 of them that filled the people with doubt. And again, we don't have time to go through the whole thing and explore the whole story, because in chapter 14 it goes on, but there's a contrast in this moment of fear and faith. There's a contrast of doubt and certainty. There's a contrast of belief and unbelief. And of the 12, there were 10 who didn't believe, and yet there were 2 who did. There were 2 who did. Their names, again, were Caleb and Joshua. And the people followed instead the fears of the 10. They followed the crowd. They followed the negative, the doubt. In fact, in our lives, in your life, in your marriage, in your relationships, with your children, isn't it easier to focus on the negative? Right? It's easier to focus sometimes on the negative. We want to be positive, but the negative just seems to be so alarming. It's like the positive in our lives whispers, "You are amazing." And the negative whispers, "You are," whatever, fill in the gap. Right? It's just the negatives are so strong. And yet, what we have to know is that there's no negative that can overcome the positive that we experience in the Word of God. And so, what ends up happening is the crowd, is the nation of Israel, as a result, they followed the 10. And because of that, a whole generation did not experience the promised land. There's a whole generation that did not experience the promised land because ultimately they doubted what God could do. They doubted the dream, the God of the dream. They doubted their part in the dream, and they allowed doubt to overcome what they believed God could do. And so ultimately, a whole generation, it says 40 years later. So a whole generation passed. For 40 years, there was a whole generation that missed out on the promise of God. In fact, as we read on, and we're not going to explore it today, I would encourage you to explore it. As we read, Moses himself didn't enter the promised land. And so Moses and that entire generation, with the exception of Caleb and Joshua, did not enter the promised land. Why? Because they doubted. Why? Because they went through a series of really doubting what God can do, and the punishment of that was that they would miss the promised land. There was a whole generation who missed it. I don't want to be a part of the generation who misses it. I want to be a part of the generation that goes forward and says, we're believing God for the dream, even when doubt, when the backstory of doubt is so big, when the backstory of doubt is screaming at us. I'm going to listen to the whisper of God to say, you can and you will, because I am with you. Anybody believe that this morning? Because the next generation was led by Joshua 40 years later. And now they're preparing to enter into the promised land. He took leadership and prepared the people to enter the promised land. And I'm sure we have to imagine that for a moment, Joshua had a lingering reminder of what doubt looked like in his mind. Maybe that's why the Lord in Joshua chapter 1 reassures him so many times, be strong and courageous. Because he knew what it was like for a whole generation to doubt the move of God. He knew what it was like for a whole generation to not believe what God could do. He knew what it was like for an entire generation to miss out on the promises of God because of the backstory of doubt in their hearts and in their minds. And Joshua, as he's preparing to enter the promised land, nevertheless, in that moment, he didn't allow doubt to determine his next steps. He held on to the faith, confidence, and belief that God would be with him and lead them forward into the promised land. And so as we prepare to close today, it's encouraging to see how God worked in the life and leadership of Joshua. He was surrounded by doubt, and yet in the end encountered the promised dream which God had for him and the people. You see, I must assume that the same doubt that consumed his contemporaries 40 years earlier was in his own heart and his own mind at any given time. However, in spite of the presence of doubt, he responded with faith and courage, remembering that God is the God of the dream. He dealt with and confronted his doubts and didn't allow them to hold him back from the promises of God in his life. And so, I'm not sure what God has promised you. I'm not sure what dream he has given you. I'm not sure where you're at in that dream and in that promise of God for your life. but I'm confident that the Lord can certainly do the impossible in your life. I'm confident that the Lord can fulfill the dream He has for us as a church. However, if I'm to be real honest, I've had my share of doubts along the way. The past couple of months, I felt like the enemy has worked overtime to cause doubt in my heart. I just have to be honest with you. During the last couple of months, there was a moment where I doubted what the Lord could do. And it was really kind of a low point for me. And at that low, the Lord spoke to me through a dream. And I want to share that dream with you today. Because I dreamt that I was going up a steep, narrow, and snowy pass. I was in a car that was insufficient. I don't know where my truck was. Maybe the fact that it's for sale right now is part of why it wasn't in the dream. And in that moment, as I'm going up this pass, I'm with my family, and I'm afraid, and I'm gripping the wheel, and it seems like the pass is getting steeper. By the moment, there's a car in front of me that I feel like is about to stall out at any time and lose its traction, which will in turn affect us. There's a truck coming down the other side, and it's too narrow for both of us. It pulls off, thank God. But in that moment, I feel like at any given moment, we're about to drop off. At any given moment, I feel like we are about, in that moment, to just fall off the side of the road and completely lose our traction. But it's in that moment that for no physical or human reason, we continue up the pass. And I know that my vehicle was insufficient, and I expect to lose traction at any moment. But we continue on, and what the Lord really revealed to me is that it was Him. And at the end of it, it was like a roller coaster by which we were going up at an extremely high pace, and the grade was so high that I felt like we were about to actually tip backwards. I feel like we were about to lose control. And it's a very vivid dream I'm having, by the way. And I'm holding on to the wheel. And with all of my strength, I'm holding on to this wheel. And as we get up towards the summit we're still moving forward, and I don't know how we're moving forward. And I wake up, and as I wake up, I'm literally, my hands are in the air, and I'm holding on to the wheel, and I'm gritting down. And as I woke up, I feel the Lord say, there's no human strength that is going to propel that car forward. I am with you. Be strong and courageous. Continue forward. I will sustain the momentum in your life and in your leadership and in the church. And all I have to know is that He is moving us forward. And even though there is a backstory of doubt that's trying to get my heart, there is a promise of God on the front side that is holding on, that I'm saying, God, you are able, God, you are faithful, and we're believing. In that moment, He removed the doubt. But doubt is stubborn. It doesn't give up that easily. In your life, doubt doesn't give up that easily. But the same God who was with Joshua is with us today. And as He moved in Joshua's life and leadership, He can do the same here today. He can move in your situation. In fact, I close with this. This week, we are believing God to build a new building here. We're believing God's going to continue to allow us to reach future generations today, right? But this week, we have a great opportunity where our utilities are getting stubbed in and ahead of any plans. And so we're excited about that. God's making a way. The guy from the city tells me, in conversation, he's like, hey, you know what? This is, we're going to go ahead and get this all done. And in the future, there may be a reimbursement. He's like, if you're real lucky, maybe there won't be any reimbursement. And I'm like, well, and I told him, I was like, well, we'll just keep praying that we get lucky. So Wednesday morning, early in the morning, I get an email. It's from the contractor, and he's emailing myself, the guy from the city, and the guy from the county. And his email says, hey, we're going to start the work either Friday or Monday, but we just want to know who's paying for it. The city guy was the first guy to speak up and say, hey, that's private development. It's not our responsibility. Wednesday morning, Wednesday afternoon at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I get a bill from the contractor for $17,000. In fact, it's $17,312 to be exact. Fear gripped my heart. Doubt gripped my heart. God, we don't have $17,000 sitting around. But I want you to know, from Wednesday, from Wednesday afternoon until today, we've already seen $7,300 come in for that to happen. And I'm just telling you, when God does something, you better know that even if there's 10 doubters, 100 doubters, even if there's a city that's doubting, a nation that's doubting, there's a God who says, I will and I can and I'm able, and if we will hold on, God will do what only He can do. How many believe that today? So as a takeaway, I leave you with this simple reminder, and we're going to worship. God's dream, not our doubt, will determine our future. God's dream, not our doubt, will determine our future. Would you stand with me? Let's worship for a moment.